In our health talk series, our guest today is Sangeeta Pradhan. She is a registered dietitian and also diabetes educator and associated with Charles River Health Associates. Also, many of you may be very familiar that she has been an integral part of our health expo every year, and she talks wonderfully about how to take care of diabetes and the diet. And today we are going to talk to her. She will be also a speaker this year again at our Health Expo in April. So Sangeeta, welcome to our studio.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Sure. And we really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
So let us get right away. And there are so many myths about diabetes and the food. And one myth which I have come across is that people think that if you reduce your calorie, you eat less food, and maybe once a day, then you might bring down your sugar. Is it true or is it totally false?
That is not true.
Okay.
So first of all, when we drastically cut down caloric intake, your body goes into something called starvation mode. It thinks it's starving. This is when you drastically reduce calories and you are down to perhaps just one meal a day. Your body will begin to lower its basal metabolic rate so that you end up burning less calories. It actually might promote more fat storage, and so you can see that then that would work against you. That's one thing. Secondly, the longer you go without food, there is a hormone called ghrelin, and ghrelin is your hunger hormone. Okay, so ghrelin rises before a meal and it continues to rise until you actually eat. It tapers off after the meal. So when you go for long periods of time without eating, ghrelin continues to build up so that by the time you eat, it's like ghrelin is almost like a monster that your hunger hormone levels are so huge that you're going to end up overeating. So that again becomes counterproductive.
So the idea is to eat less but more frequently.
Yes. So what you want to do is spread out your meals. Eat perhaps, I would say maybe 3 meals and at least I would say 1 to 2 snacks. And by doing so, you keep this ghrelin monster, so to speak, or your hunger hormone in check. And also it helps with stabilizing blood sugars.
So if I ask you to help me map out snacks and meal schedule in a day or in 24 hours, how will you help me out to do that?
You're talking about your eating pattern?
The eating pattern and the time and schedule.
Okay, so ideally, as I said, you definitely want 3 square meals, no matter what, breakfast, lunch and dinner. And then in between, if you could plug in a snack, that would really help stabilize blood sugars. Because that would be in sync with this ghrelin cycle that I was talking about.
Now, what about the proportion and the size of the meals?
So that to some extent would have to be individualized to the patient. So I would definitely recommend to the audience that they set up an appointment with a registered dietitian or a certified diabetes educator to help them plan their meals. Your question was on the proportion?
Yes, the size.
The size of the meal. Are you talking about carb content? Are you talking about protein content?
Let's talk about both. Like, should we cut down the carb and increase the protein? Or there should be a balance?
You need to have, so there's 3 macronutrients in our diet. So to answer your question correctly, I'm just going to start from scratch. So we have 3 what are called macronutrients in our diet. Macro, large, nutrients, substances that nourish the body, right? So these are carbohydrates, proteins and fats. Carbohydrates are fuel for your body, proteins are building blocks, and certain hormones are made from fat. Also, fat-soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K, cannot be absorbed unless you have a certain minimal amount of fat in the diet. So, a well-balanced meal combines all three: carbs, proteins, as well as fats. The American Diabetes Association recommends roughly 45 to 50, up to 55% of calories from carbohydrate. About 30% of calories from fats, and the remaining from protein. So the interplay of all these nutrients in the right proportions then creates a well-balanced meal, which then will promote not just even and optimal blood sugars, but just overall good health.
Now, in terms of calories, in a day, how many calories is a good amount for an adult?
Again, Upendraji, that has to be individualized to the patient. And it's individualized not just based upon anthropometrics, in other words, height, weight, and activity level, but it also to some extent has to be individualized based upon what is that person's typical intake. Let me explain. A lot of folks come to us because they have misguided, preconceived notions about weight loss and diabetes. So it's not unusual sometimes to have someone who's 6 feet tall but who's consuming very few carbohydrates because there's this mistaken notion that carbs turn to sugar, I have diabetes, let me just cut out all carbs. So they may actually come to us with, I'm not exaggerating, less than 1500 calories a day. But that's not actually conducive necessarily to good blood sugars. So we now have to adjust the caloric intake so that we might actually end up giving them more rather than less. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's not always about cutting out excess or cutting out calories. Sometimes you have to add back the nutrients that the body needs to function optimally.
So now, I just want to get a number from you.
Sure.
Say, I'm say 40-year-old.
Yeah.
And then my height is 6 feet, and weight is say 180 pounds. So roughly for this type of profile, how many calories a day will be good?
I would
to just get an idea.
Right, just to give you a ballpark figure,
Sure.
6 feet tall, 180 pounds, did you say?
Yes.
I would say somewhere, I don't know what their activity level is.
Sure, okay.
Just a ballpark figure, I would say somewhere between 1800 to 2000 calories a
Got
day.
it, okay.
This is completely,
just totally to
Right,
just
right,
get an
absolutely,
idea.
yeah.
We're not going to hold you.
No, I
to
know,
this
I know,
number.
I know that.
Now,
yeah.
the second, we are also going to talk in great detail about diabetic epidemic among Asians and Indians a little bit later.
Yes.
But before we go there, since we're talking about food and nutrition,
Sure.
I would also like to ask you is, for Indians who are here, it is very difficult to calculate the calories and all this stuff here.
Right.
And also we don't know that we know what type of food we should be taking more and all those things. So is there any way you can give us a list, two lists, the one list of these are the food in Indian diet you must eat, and these are the food you should try to avoid, if not at least you cut it down.
Sure.
So let us go with a list
Okay.
which we should be eating.
Okay, so the foods that I would really recommend in the typical Indian diet that would be favorable not just for diabetes but cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, weight loss, what have you, would be whole grains. Whole grains, so whole wheat flour, the chapati flour that we use. What I recommend is combine perhaps, I would say 2/3 whole wheat, higher fiber chapati flour. Look at the label for the actual fiber and go with the highest fiber content. Combine that with jowar or bajra flour to make a very high fiber.
So jowar
roti.
and bajra flour, we get it here in the store.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But again, do your homework. Look at the label. Choose the product with the highest fiber content and make a high fiber roti.
Now I'm going to start with just for 1 second here. Now, when it comes to the labels on the Indian food and Indian things, many of us are very skeptical. We don't know is it really true or how. What has been your experience as a dietitian?
They have to follow the guidelines that I've set forth over here.
Yeah, exactly.
So for now, I would take it at face value.
Perfect. Okay.
I would just take it at face value.
So let's go back to our
Sure.
discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so now you have these whole grains that are very high in fiber, and along with that, I would include what are called legumes or pulses in India. We call them pulses. So whole moong, whole masoor, but try to sprout them. Because when you sprout them, you're basically packing the power of a germinating seed that is chock full of nutrients. Potassium, magnesium, fiber, all important fiber. Some of the B vitamins. So you're getting foods that give you the biggest bang for your buck. All right. Also, you want some fruits and vegetables. Vegetables are considered free. They are so high in fiber, so low in carbs, and so rich in antioxidants that you can have a large amount of vegetables without worrying about their caloric value.
So any special vegetables you recommend for diabetic people?
You can have any non-starchy vegetable. So when I say non-starchy, that would obviously exclude potatoes. Peas and corn are considered starchy vegetables. Now, I just want to make something clear. That is not to say that you cannot include them. You can absolutely include them in your diet. However, they have to be worked into what's called a quote-unquote carbohydrate allowance.
Okay.
So when you sit down with a registered dietitian, she will be able to map out your meal plan so that you could actually include aloo matar, what have you, but it's included within a carbohydrate allowance so that it does not adversely impact your blood sugars.
So basically, you're saying that the vegetables are okay, except few exceptions.
Vegetables, yes, non-starchy vegetables, so bhindi and tindora and bangan, obviously onions and tomatoes, all of these, palak, gobi and so forth are considered free. You can include them in your diet on a regular basis, as I said, without worrying about caloric content. Obviously, the oil that you use for the tadka is not free. That's obvious. But they are considered free. Now, just one word of caution. When we have folks with advanced diabetes, in other words, they've had the diabetes for many years, 25 years. And the diabetes is very, what we call brittle. The blood sugars are very labile. What happens is...
What do you mean labile?
Labile means they have high blood sugars followed by low, followed by high, followed by low. And it's very difficult to understand the etiology behind it. It's because the diabetes has advanced to a point where the pancreas is actually producing very little insulin. There is very little endogenous insulin, and so occasionally what we see is even some non-starchy vegetables can actually cause a spike in blood sugar. For instance, carrots may adversely impact blood sugars. Mind you, there could be other factors that are coming into play, but just a word of caution that when I say non-starchy vegetables are considered free for folks who are insulin dependent, that's where you really need to sit down with a registered dietitian and get their recommendation in terms of how to work out.
What about fruits, which we can eat easily?
So, I'm so glad
Okay.
you asked that question, Upendraji, because a very common myth out there is that I have diabetes, I cannot eat fruit because fruit is sugar.
Sure.
Correct? So sugars are part of your carbohydrates. Fruits, yes, fruits have sugar, but fruits are also accompanied by a nutrient, I guess you could call it a nutrient, called fiber. And what fiber does is it slows down digestion, it slows down the spike in sugar, and it actually levels out blood sugars. So fruits in moderate amounts are acceptable even in a diabetic meal plan, but usually I recommend about maybe 3 to up to 4 servings a day for folks who have their diabetes under reasonable control. And to put it very simply, a small fruit is considered 1 serving, a larger fruit 2. Now, it's going to vary for fruits like grapes, berries, and so on and so forth. That's where you could use diabetic exchanges to plan out the meal.
What about the 2 fruits I want to talk specifically? One is mango and one is banana. So how they play with diabetes?
Okay, that's also a very good question. So the diabetic exchanges have been set up so that fruits, the carb content, based upon the carb content in the fruit, that drives the serving size. So if a fruit happens to be higher in sugar, the serving size by default is small. So that takes care of itself. So to go back to the mango, half of a large mango is considered 1 serving. Or was your the other question the banana?
Yes.
Okay, so half of a banana is considered 1 serving. But what's wonderful about these exchanges is there's actually a weight. So you can't go wrong. Because, you might be tempted to say, oh well, this is 1 banana and this is only 2 fruits. But if it's a particularly large banana, it actually might be 3.
Sure.
So that's your fruit allowance for the whole day. Does that make sense?
No, it does, yes. Now, also, we hear that the mango can have too much sugar and it should be avoided by people who have a diabetes.
So that's my point.
Okay.
Because
like any amount of mango is bad, is that true? No.
Well, again, indiscriminate consumption of anything is not good. But what I'm saying is, if it is high in sugar, by default, the portion size will be small anyways.
Okay.
Does that make
No,
sense? So
sure,
you can still work it in.
Okay.
It's not forbidden. But the other recommendation I would like to make, if I may, is as you plan out your meals, check your 2-hour postprandial or post-meal sugar to see the impact of that meal composition on your blood sugar. And you will notice that you tend to, because it can vary from individual to individual, and you might notice that certain foods drive up your blood sugars a tad more than others, and then you can plan your meal accordingly.
Now, one more question on the fruits. What about dry fruits?
Very good question again. So because dried fruits, as you can imagine, are very concentrated in sugar. They're dried.
Yeah.
So they are dehydrated. Sugar content is much higher. Once again, by default, the serving size is very small. 2 tablespoons of dried fruit constitutes 1 serving. Whereas a small apple is 1 serving. A small orange or half of a large orange is 1 serving. So if you want, let's just say, for the sake of argument, if you wanted 4 carb servings in one meal, if you included 2 tablespoons of the raisins, you count it as 1 out of the 4.
Now, let us come back to the list B.
Okay.
The foods and fruits and vegetables to avoid, or really cut it down if possible.
So the foods to avoid would be foods that are very high in saturated fat. So such as ghee. Mind you, small amounts of ghee, small amounts of coconut, also a form of saturated fat, are perfectly acceptable. But there is this trend out there where a lot of folks, and you may have seen it, you may have noticed it, Upendraji, a lot of folks are sprinkling coconut into everything from smoothies to curries and what have you. And that's a somewhat disturbing trend. Coconut actually has 91% saturated fat. Even butter, which we all know has saturated fat, has only 67%. So it's important to exercise some prudence when it comes to high saturated fat foods, because when you have diabetes, your risk of heart disease is also
Very
significantly higher. And saturated fat foods will clog your arteries. They will drive up your bad cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol. I like to call it lousy.
What about rice?
So, thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
Refined carbohydrates. And by refined carbohydrates, we mean carbohydrates that have been stripped of fiber. Essentially, they take this intact grain, they pulverize it in a mill and create some sort of either superfine white flour when you start with whole wheat, or in the case of rice, they remove the bran, creating polished white rice. So polished white rice, because the fiber is gone, will cause huge spikes in blood sugar. Especially when we eat foods such as pulao or khichdi or biryani, most of us will not stop at a half a cup.
Sure.
So the glycemic load of that particular food is going to be huge. This means a large amount of insulin from the pancreas, causing a crash in blood sugar, which then prompts hunger and triggers us to reach for the same white carbs or refined carbs again, causing another spike. So one could keep doing the roller coaster throughout the day if we consume foods that are refined. So I would suggest try to switch from white rice to some sort of a whole grain.
Is there any study that, for example, if I take white rice, say for a month, and then I want to stop it, and the next month I'm going to go to totally brown rice. So is there any study gives us a number that by what percentage you can cut down your sugar level by switching to brown rice?
There is, I don't know
If
if
you
there's
don't
any.
have the number,
right,
then
right.
don't worry about it.
Yes, but let me just tell you, there was a huge study called the Nurses' Health Study that showed that the quality of carbohydrates consumed, not just the quantity, the quality of carbs consumed and the quality of fats consumed make a difference to your risk of diabetes. So what that study showed was that polished white rice caused spikes in blood sugar, whereas cereal fiber, interestingly, did not. And polyunsaturated fats also helped mediate the risk of diabetes. The other study that they looked at showed that for every 1% incremental increase in polished grains increased your risk of diabetes by 11%.
That's very...
Yes. And not only that, if you increase your intake of whole grains by 2 servings, you reduce your risk of diabetes by 21%.
That's a big difference, yeah.
Yes, so those numbers are very compelling, and it creates a very solid argument again for watching the quality of your carbohydrates. Less refined, more whole. And the traditional Indian diet is actually chock full of whole grains and higher fiber carbs.
Now, before we come to our last part of the conversation, I just wanted to get back again to the ghee part of our Indian diet. Now, we hear mixed views about ghee. Some people say ghee is actually not that bad, it is just, it's healthy, and some people say that no, it is really bad for arteries. So what is your take on ghee?
So ghee, as I mentioned before, is a form of saturated fat, but it, unlike certain forms of saturated fat that come from processed animal meats, which that would be, and most Indian folks may not necessarily eat these foods, but some might, so I just want to point that.
This is the one thing I tell everybody to keep their phone off. I forgot about it. So
you'll have to start again, right?
Yeah, this part, the ghee part, we are going to start.
So you want me to just start again?
No, I'll ask a question and then you.
Yeah.
So I want you to bring back again to the question of ghee. And ghee is a very controversial topic, especially in the Indian diet and the Indian community. There are some who believe that ghee is not that bad, and it has been just given a bad name. And some people think that it is really bad, and it's really bad for your heart and arteries. Mm-hmm. As a dietitian and as someone who has familiar with Indian food, what is your take on that?
So, ghee, as I mentioned before, is a form of saturated fat. Saturated fat in excess, so I just want to kind of underscore that, in excess amounts will raise lousy cholesterol, LDL, which ends up clogging arteries, raising heart disease risk. Having said that, if you are able to keep your saturated fat intake under 10% for most healthy individuals, but under 7% for folks with heart disease, you can work in small amounts of ghee into your diet. Mm-hmm. It is also a more pure form of saturated fat, which distinguishes it from a processed form of saturated fat, such as the fat from hot dogs, bacon, sausage, and so on and so forth. So from that standpoint, ghee has some redeeming factors.
Excellent. Now coming back to the last part of our discussion today is the diabetes has really become an epidemic in the Indian and Asian population, at our home country as well as here in the US right. too. So do you have any thoughts on what is happening? Why this is so prevalent in the Indian and Asian population?
So yes, diabetes has become a global epidemic, with Asia at the epicenter of the disease. In fact, 60% of the world's diabetes population is in Asia. Why is this happening? The reasons are multifactorial, but to keep things simple, we could distill this down to two important contributing factors. Number one is genetic susceptibility. As an ethnic group, we tend to have more what's called visceral obesity. In other words, we tend to have a higher amount of abdominal fat and lesser muscle mass, which then translates to increased insulin resistance. That's one thing, and there's not a whole lot you can do about your genes.
Sure.
The second factor has to do with unfavorable changes in our environment from diet, lifestyle, and becoming more sedentary. So those are, going back to the second point though, those are modifiable risk factors. Diet can be modified, weight, yes, it can be modified, We may struggle with it, but it is potentially a modifiable risk factor, and so is activity. But the important take-home message is that it only takes 5 to 10% weight loss. Just a modest 5 to 10% weight loss can significantly impact the progression of diabetes. If you have pre-diabetes, this is the time to nip it in the bud and prevent it from progressing to full-blown. But even if you have diabetes, you can delay the progression of the disease with that modest 5 to 10% weight loss and diet. There's all kinds of clinical trials, including the diabetes prevention program, that demonstrated this.
Okay. Now, this is a final question, okay? This may be very helpful to our viewers and readers, is if I come to you and ask you that, look, I'm severe diabetic, and I want you to just plan my meal for a day, just for one day. The breakfast, lunch, dinner, and a couple of snacks. What will you recommend that this is how you should start? Like simple, like if I want to make a schedule or timetable.
Are you looking for something with primarily Indian-based foods?
Indian-based foods,
Sure.
yes, yeah. I mean, our readership and viewership is mostly Indian, so.
Okay.
Yes.
So, if you're looking for Indian-based foods,
One day schedule.
One day schedule. Okay, so one thing I might recommend is you could make upma with cracked wheat because it's higher in fiber, and you could include, you want no more than, I would say, about a cup of that. So if you want the nitty gritty, that's about 2 carbohydrate servings. You can have maybe a glass of milk. With that, that's another carb, or yogurt, just plain yogurt, and maybe a small fruit. If you're looking for just an Indian breakfast, so that would be an example. Or you could have high fiber oatmeal with the same sort of composition that I just discussed. Lunch, I would do maybe 2 or 3 high fiber rotis, okay, with maybe let's just say 3/4 of a cup of some sort of sprouted moong, masoor, that sort of thing. So that gives you protein and fiber, and you can have, I would say, a good cup, maybe a cup and a half of non-starchy sabzi. Okay. Alternately, instead of the 3 rotis, you could also do a cup of brown rice or a cup of quinoa. Just a word of caution on brown rice, it has arsenic. So if folks are interested, I happen to have a blog where I have talked extensively about arsenic in brown rice and how to reduce its content. So that would be lunch.
Definitely.
Okay. In between though, I would try to plug in a snack. So between lunch and dinner, I might recommend having a small 1 serving of fruit. But also grab perhaps a 1/4 cup of, up to 1/3 of a cup of unsalted nuts with it. Why? Because nuts are high in protein, high in the healthy fats, and they will actually, again, might actually help lower your blood sugars while keeping you full. Dinner would be very similar to what I discussed with lunch, and then after dinner you might want to have a serving of yogurt or maybe some cottage cheese. Cottage cheese, mind you, is pure protein, has no carbs whatsoever. Not that carbs are bad, as we just established, but if you're looking for some sort of a snack that doesn't have carbs because you have a carb allowance for the day, then cottage cheese, maybe mixed in with a few berries, would also make a good snack.
What about drinks?
You want to stay away from sugar-sweetened beverages. So those are
Which will be Coke, Pepsi.
Regular sodas, so very stunning and I don't know what else to say. It's really astonishing. 1 can of soda gives you 10 teaspoons of sugar. 1 Think about it.
Yeah.
Who would ever put 10 teaspoons of sugar in their cup of coffee? But that's precisely what we ingest when we drink that can of soda. So stay away from sugar-sweetened beverages, fruit juices, because again, because they are liquids, they cause quick spikes in sugar.
Well, Sangeeta, thank you very much for your time, and
pleasure.
looking forward to listening you at the Health Expo.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.